Welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. Hey, Earthkeepers. Forrest here, wishing you hope and perseverance as we begin the new year. At the end of last year, I spoke with my friend, Victoria Loorz, about the ways in which a more ecologically conscious faith offers hope for edgewalkers. That's a term we use to describe Christ followers who have moved away from the center of conventional church and moved toward the creative edges of the institution, those generative marginal spaces where new imaginings and alternative expressions of faith are being explored. In this episode, I continue that conversation with Victoria, who you may recall is co-founder of the Wild Church movement and current director of the Center for Wild Spirituality. In this episode, we consider the pragmatic question, what are some of the things we can actually do to practice a more ecologically informed faith life? Here then is part 2 of my conversation with Victoria Loorz. Well, Victoria, we have had a great discussion, kind of on the meta level of things, talking about bigger shifts and movements as a context for wild spirituality. I hope now we can maybe pivot a bit to shift our focus and address the needs of podcast listeners who might be looking for practical ways to bring new life to their faith practices, new energy or new perspective. Maybe we could talk about some ways that people might consider integrating more creation-centered practices into their daily lives. Now, I defer to your wisdom and experience in such matters, but I will try to bring an idea or two to the conversation as well. And we should probably assure our listeners that we won't recommend any practices that we haven't experienced ourselves. So let me start with a question for you. How has your faith life personally been impacted over the years by practices grounded in physical realities, really, of creation?
Yeah, I think I was considering this and wrestling with this for several years. Are these just my own personal experiences and I just need to keep it separate from at least separate from my church life? Or can I actually call them spiritual practices? Are these actually separate from my religious tradition?
Well, that's such an important point, right? Because the reason we even ask that question at all is because we're used to having kind of cookie-cutter approaches to what faith looks like, prayer looks like, what contemplation looks like. I don't know that, at least for you and I, our church contexts really encouraged maybe more creative, innovative thinking about how we encounter the divine.
Yeah, I made the mistake once in those years of sharing an encounter I had with where I felt like I was in the presence of God when I was sitting in a tree. And I didn't even use the kind of language of God was the tree or anything like that. But the pastor of the church I was part of called me up afterward. God is not a tree. I was like, I never said God was a tree, but it was just, there's a fear around it. We have fearful words like animism or pantheism or things. And so, yeah, there's a reason why they're separated. In fact, a lot of people, I think, who are leaning into this feel like it's a bit of a coming out on both sides. Like I was in the church, like to be able to talk about these experiences of numinous presence, at the very least, of the presence of God, which in a traditional church context is threatening for some reason. And like when I was in the climate movement, to bring in any kind of spirituality was threatening. So like getting my church to climb on board in whatever the latest climate campaign is, that's cool. Seeing the church as another venue of getting more people involved in your climate campaign. But to actually talk about your spirituality in the context of climate movement kind of things was totally separate. So it's like these two lives that a lot of us have been living. And that actually led to burnout for me. And it was the beginning for me was like, no, actually, these are connected. My very disconnection is part of the problem here. And so the very beginning was when I had been exploring these ideas theologically. I began with looking into scripture. Is this really true that Christianity cannot comprehend or allow a spirituality that is grounded in the ground? It is grounded in relationship with the rest of the natural world. Is that true? And so that began my first theological kind of exploration and scriptural. And I found very quickly, no, it's not true. But then it was like, okay, what do you do about it? And so when I left being a pastor, I had been exploring these ideas for a couple of years with the congregation I was in. I was an associate pastor. And people gathered around me and they were like, that you've been talking about, that's where I want to go to church. And I was all, yeah, I'm making that up. That's not a thing. And so that was really the beginning of exploring Church of the Wild.
Sure.
And so we got together and we just started creating practices that reconnect us with our place as holy ground at the very minimum, and to reconnect with our place as holy relationship. And so that transition and that practice, and I love the word practice. Buddhist talks about it, a Buddhist practice. We don't really talk about it as Christian practice. We do talk about spiritual practices, though. Thinking about a practice as something you practice. You just are experimenting, you're playing, you're engaging. And so we began to create practices that did exactly what you said. So the main one is something that might be called a saunter, which means into the holy. The saints would walk these paths. That's where the word saunter comes from, and it's walking a path into the Holy Lands. So it's like a wandering. And so it's just what the center of Wild Church service is basically you leave the circle, you're meeting outdoors, you're in a circle. We always have a time where you leave that circle to go on basically a solo saunter. To just even 20 minutes. Usually I do for 45 minutes, but you can do it a whole day, where you're just really opening up yourself to the possibility that this land is holy, that this land is connected with you, and see what happens. I love this quote, John O'Donohue, where he says something like, when you approach with reverence, whether it's a child or a tree, when you approach with reverence, great things decide to approach you. And it's a beautiful poetic way of saying how we approach life, how we approach the land, how we approach one another. When we approach with reverence, it's inviting the holy presence. To me, that's what it is. That's what a conversation is. It's inviting the holy presence into the in-betweenness. And so that practice shifted my theology, but my whole way of envisioning and practicing and living a spiritual life. And so it's encountering then everything with that reverence.
Yeah. I think, though, that choice to expect something new, to expect to encounter the sacred, that's the courageous choice and not the easy one to make. Interestingly, I had a conversation with John Philip Newell this morning about his new book. And I'll tell you what that book is, because I am now recommending it to everyone. It's called The Great Search, Turning to Earth and Soul in the Quest for Healing and Home. So, yeah, he basically organizes the book around the lives of maybe significant spiritual thinkers and practitioners, and talks about how the contribution of their lives can answer the needs that people are feeling today in their deepest places. But I'll just say, one interesting point that I thought he made, because we talked about this fear. Why are people afraid to say anything, but the Bible is good enough for me and I'll stick to it? If it's not in the Bible, it's not anywhere. And he made a good point that when the church centuries ago agreed to that proposition, sola scriptura, he said maybe at the time it made sense for a particular place and people, but he said on the face of it, it's a nonsensical assertion. He says to think that God is limited to the pages of a book It's crazy, right? And so he says we need to be more critical of those traditions, especially those that contribute to that fear that you were talking about, the fear to step out, the fear to think that we can encounter God in other places and in other ways than what has been prescribed to us in church capital C. So, yeah, I would say that with James and I, when we do our teachings, we find that it's not so much a matter of getting people to choose a way forward that they've never experienced before, but instead it's about remembering. And one thing we do is we talk about remember those places in your life that have particular significance, those places where maybe have been the happy places or the safe places, and maybe the places even where you've experienced a sense of depth, a sense of a numinous, as you would put it. And think about that. Think about what it is about that place and your experience of that place that was significant. And then we help people to see that that's really what we're talking about, right? It's not anything new.
We already experienced this. We know.
At the very least, we've experienced that kind of wonder and connection as children. And so if we can remember back to that capacity, I think that's a less scary place to embark on these sorts of adventures. Yeah.
And I think that's it. Like people ask me all the time, like, have you gotten a lot of pushback from the church? And I really haven't. And I think it's because I begin with, we know this.
Yeah.
We've experienced this. And it is remembering. I love that word. And I like that word too. Like we are remembering ourselves back into relationship. We are members of a giant relationship that's interconnected. Mm-hmm. And so it has been forgotten, as Thomas Berry talks about all the time. And I think just the expectations is a good word too. And we do this at Wild Church, or we do this at Seminary of the Wild, where before you enter into this intentional, I think intention might be even a better word than expectation, in this intentionality of opening up your intuition, opening up all your senses, opening up all it is to be human, the senses and what I like to call the non-senses, the non-senses of your intuition, your imagination. And so opening up, I like to step over a log or something and say, I'm crossing this threshold into enchanted, holy land. And I'm going to open up all of my senses to be avail myself to the holy that is present here and can be experienced. And that intentionality is what opens you up. And I think holding that expectation lightly, it's like you don't go out there to get something. Just like a relationship, you don't go into a relationship with something just to get something from another person. That's like weird guru kind of thing. You're in relationship, and so you're deepening into relationship with this place that is holy. And so just remembering that this is holy. I love the Jacob story of falling asleep in the wilderness with his head on a rock. And he's running away from his brother because he did something pretty crappy, stole his brother's blessing. And so his brother's pursuing him. He sleeps and has this dream where heaven and earth is connected. And God says to him in the dream, like, all of this, life is coming through you. All of this is holy. And he wakes up and he's like, I didn't even see it. I couldn't see it anymore, but all of this is holy land. It's like all of us are waking up with that same revelation of this is actually holy land. All of it's holy. All of it's sacred. It's been desacralized, perhaps. And so our witnessing, our bringing witness, and we can resacralize that which has been desacralized. Like a parking lot has been asphalted over what was a holy forest. And we can bring our grief and our just acknowledgement, I think, is a spiritual practice, that this was a place where a lot of creatures lived, and it was given up to one particular species. And not that it should or shouldn't happen, but it has happened. And so we are part of nature, and I think part of this holy interconnected miracle. I wanted to plug a little bit. There's a book that my sister and I, who runs the Wild Church Network, wrote that comes out in March. It's called The Field Guide to Church of the Wild. And in there are hundreds of ideas for these kinds of spiritual practices. And we didn't just come and think of a bunch of them. We asked about 30 to 40 different wild church leaders. What are some things that you do in these different parts? We sort of broke it up on different aspects, like a benediction and sacraments and grounding and worship practice. So they're broken up throughout the book of these different kinds of practices. And then we have just stories upon stories, little paragraphs, maybe some are longer, of here's a way you can do a communion practice in relationship with your place. Here's something you can do with kids in relationship with your place and deepening that holy relationship. So it's something re-emerging that's emerging in a new way, but it's nothing new. Yeah. It's nothing new to humans, for sure. And it's actually nothing new to Christianity. So yeah, there's lots of ideas.
Well, I want to pick up on your general idea of sauntering, of wandering with expectation and intention. I have been asked before when I've talked about this idea with people, what do you do when you don't have access to some beautiful natural place where you can go off and be alone? And I realized that for me, that actually has been a challenge because I've lived in really urban contexts before. For example, living in Istanbul, it was almost impossible to get away from people.
Of course, there's lots of cats there, so.
There are a lot of cats and dogs, and yeah, I have scary feral dog stories. And then there's the sea there as well. So there's plenty to remind you of the natural world. But one of the habits I developed was walking and talking. I think sometimes the practice of talking out loud, talking perhaps to God, talking perhaps to nature, but talking aloud, it's a qualitatively different experience than just sort of meditating in silence. And I found that I could actually make that work because of the advent of new technology. When people wear their earbuds or their phone earpieces and they're walking along the sidewalk, talking out loud, nobody cares, right? So I just wear my iPods and I keep my phone in my hand and I just talk away and no one even knows. Yeah. So I think this sort of wandering can happen anywhere you want it to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's actually somebody on our team who's working on a podcast about living in New York City and deeply connecting with the natural world as spiritual practice.
Good for him.
And so it can happen anywhere. I'll give you a couple of examples in my own life. Well, one of the things we have for our Samurai of the Wild participants next week is one of the invitations is sit and watch a spider build their web for a half an hour. Like it's the most fascinating thing ever. It's just find a spider, which is everywhere, and watch them. It's something shifts within you to see this other being and as a miraculous being, to see this other being with their own needs and their own life and their own things that they're connected to and their own gifts and talents is helping to shift the worldview, that this human-centric worldview that is part of colonization. So it is a decolonizing practice as well, to regard an other as inherently valuable, which is to regard another, to show appreciation for the inherent worth of another. Somebody asked me once at a talk I was giving, the Bible says that you should not worship nature. And I'm like, first of all, show that to me, where it actually says that. Secondly, what do you mean by the word worship? What do you mean? Do you mean it's worthship, which the word means? It's worth my appreciation? In that case, maybe I am showing worthship of this tree, but something shifts within you. And so just with the spider thing, I've never been like terrified of spiders, but my first thought is how to kill them, how to get them out of my house.
Right.
And just like a year ago, I noticed within me something had shifted because I was giving a talk somewhere, opened up a sliding glass door before it started, and I saw a spider in there with a whole nest. And I was like, oh, look at her. Look at this mama. And just shifting like your pronoun from it, oh my God, let's get rid of it, to look at her, shifted it within me. And I got a cup and a thing and I moved the mama and all of her babies way away from the house because I don't want them in the house. But something shifts within you. And so I think that's what a practice is. A practice is something that you are practicing the presence, practicing the presence of God in all of your life. And so the more you do it, the more you can notice how you are shifting to see all of life as sacred. It's a way of seeing reality. It's a way of being in relationship with other people, with all the more than human people, with all of life. God is in everything. God is not just in church. It's not just about humans.
I like the way that Edmund Muir says it. He calls it looking for the light of the eternal in all things and to be experiencing the presence of the immortal within everything that has being. When you look at a spider with that perspective, it can't only be an object of fear because you can't help but marvel at the presence of the sacred in that created being.
And there's something too, I remember there was a time I was at a wild church and I stayed at the circle while everybody else went out wandering. And I was like, all right, what am I going to focus? Here's another one, like the gnats. The gnats were there. Gnats are everywhere. I went, whoa, what if there's a different layer of how could I appreciate these gnats? And so I shifted something in me to appreciate them, and they stopped bothering me. I had to force myself to not be reactively flicking them away. And after just a couple minutes, they were gone. And I think there is some kind of, we're interconnected in ways that we don't understand. God is so much bigger, that relationship to say, I love nature, or I love the earth, or I love children is too big. You can love it with a certain kind of love, but what I really encourage is this, and I think we talked about this last time too, a little, it's just like it's falling in love. Like you fall in love with a particular other. You fall in love with a particular child. And through that intense love, you are deep in capacity to love all. And so I think that's true even with falling in love with particular others in your place. Where you go back to the same little bend in the road on a creek that's nearby. You go back to the same little trees in a park. You go back to the same garden and you get to know them. And something Robin Wall Kimmerer, as an indigenous, I think we all have heard of braiding sweetgrass. If we haven't all read it yet, we should. But she talks about how there's a reciprocity in that relationship, in that sacred relationship. And when you love, the other loves you back in ways that you don't necessarily love. I mean, even within spouses, learning our love languages and learning how people like to be loved and like to love is different. And so extrapolate that. So the way that Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about how the earth loves us by providing food, by providing air and water. And we love back through appreciation, through poetry, through tending and being loving tenders of our land. But there's all kinds of ways that reciprocity of relationship is mirrored. That is what God as a personal God, as relationship. We use relational words to have metaphors for God because that is the most meaningful way to understand love. And so understanding God as love is like one of the foundational ways of understanding, of experiencing God. And so the more we practice love with one another as humans, the more we practice love with one another as beyond humans, all of that is spiritual practice because all of it is remembering how to love.
No, I like your point about how sometimes we can cultivate that love by revisiting the familiar, by spending time. I think once upon a time in another podcast session with me, you talked about a certain tree in Bellingham. I think it was a cedar tree that you would meditate with and by on a regular basis. And it was the familiarity, I think, which allowed you to form relationship with that tree.
Yeah. Just like a human.
Yes, very much like human relationship. And I have since that time really likened that dynamic to perhaps the way that I connect to nature the most, which is through gardening. Because in gardening, it's very much a long-term relationship. And if you spend enough time with a certain piece of land or a certain plant even, you get to know its habits, you get to see the cycles it goes through. I think even on some level, you get a sense of its being in a way. Yeah. But I found that for a while, for many years, I would just sort of give up that way of connecting when the gardening season had passed, although one can still, I've learned, spend lots of good time in the garden in the winter. But I really came to embrace the practice of indoor gardening, which probably most people can do. And even something as simple as a cactus. If you tend a cactus, if you visit that cactus every day in your room by your window, I think you begin to see new degrees of mystery, really, within that cactus. And I know not everyone is going to relate to that, but I know for me, that has become one of my wintertime practices to engage the sort of non-human beings in my life.
Mm-hmm. I did that similar path. I've never been a great gardener. Like I've tried doing gardens and I get all excited when it gets all leafy. When the vegetables come, I get anxious that I'm not doing it fast enough or whatever. I always would say I don't have a green thumb. And after doing this work after a while, it's like, I got to change that story that I have about myself. And so I just started with little potted plants, like these little guys. It's like, I need to practice what I preach here. And even just starting with little plants. And so now I have all these plants on my deck and in my house. And I do know them. Like I'm really proud of this one that started out as this little tiny plant. And now I've transplanted her and she's huge. It's like huge. And every time someone comes over, I'm all excited to show her off and everything. So it's like we've developed a relationship. That's what makes it a spiritual practice, relationship. That to me, that's just like, this is simple stuff. If God is love, then how do I practice love? God is love, then how do I practice love in my family and in all the layers? You can't just go partly. I think I talked about that last time. You can't just love with part of your heart.
Yeah.
It's like opening up to people that are different from you, people who believe things very, very different from you. How do you actually love them? And it's different than you would love your own daughter, but it's still worthy of experimenting, worthy of your attention, your expectations of, if I invest in this, what am I wanting out of this? And so you can do that with other people, and we need to. God, of all times, this is a time culturally as well as ecologically that we need to remember how to love and what that looks like. So, yeah.
Why don't you give me another example of one of these pragmatic, practical practices that you discovered with your sister?
I'll give you an example of a practice within a wild church that you don't need to be with other people, that you could do on your own, is with what I mentioned before with communion. One of the things that was a big aha to me, and I was exploring even theologically first, and then with like, how do I experience this? How do I integrate this with how I do communion? First in the indoor church, and I would do it in wild church, and then on my own. And one of them was just reckoning with this reality that for any one being to survive a day or a week, we have to consume the aliveness of another being. I really, really don't like that. But it's true. Whether it's a carrot as an alive being or a cow as an alive being, we need to consume each other. That's how life is. We may not like it. We may wish it was different, that predation wasn't a thing. But most of my life, I was a vegetarian for a long time because I would never kill an animal. So why am I okay with other people killing animals? And this is what shifted it for me, was reckoning with that reality, that this is how we are. There's something in the way life is that is meant to be, that God created. And so how do I lean into that instead of always sort of disliking it or fantasizing that there's some future where that doesn't happen, where death isn't real on some other beyond life way, which may or may not, I don't know what happens after life. I believe certain things, but I don't know how that works or what it looks like. But how do I bring that into now? How do I practice that as a spiritual practice? And so it shifted me from, yes, Jesus's life, blood and body is something I'm consuming, but it's also sort of microcosm of the way all of life works, the way all of nature is, and that we are meant to be the blood and body is given in service to others, right? We kind of get that sort of theoretically sounds good, but the reality that this little mosquito that is so annoying and just bit me again, The other day, this hit me. I got all these mosquito bites when I was out. And I sort of took a second of, wow, I just gave life to a whole bunch of little insects. This is part of reality. And instead of being so obsessed with my own safety and my own life, how can I share my life even with a mosquito? It doesn't mean I don't wear mosquito repellent. But when it happens, how can I reframe that? And how can I see even a mosquito bite as a moment of wild communion that is participating in this, offering ourselves to one another in this interconnected reality?
So I'm trying to figure out if getting bitten by a mosquito is the sacrament you started to describe. No?
Yes.
It is.
There it is. But I didn't intend it.
Sure.
When it happens, it's like we don't intend the suffering that's just real, part of life, the pain. But when it happens, how we hold it, our intentionality, and the expectation, even that is holy. Even that is a being with God. How do we turn all the things, all of life, into something that is sacred?
Yeah. No, I hear you. I hear you. Yeah. And so many people that I've talked to in the podcast have recommended a greater awareness of our food, where our food comes from, awareness of the soil, awareness of our connection to the system, right. Which, to be frank, we could, in the best, the healthiest system, become food ourselves for other beings in time, that we become part of that cycle. But unfortunately, the sort of sanitization of death and our isolation in boxes and embalming, I think, is meant to give us the illusion that that's not true, that we're not part of the cycle, though we're exceptional somehow from the rest of nature.
I was just reading an article today about, it's been 25 years since they reintroduced the wolves to Yellowstone. I think most people have seen the video that came out about a dozen years ago about just reintroduce this predator, changed the whole system and made the whole system healthier, even the water and the streams and everything. And we're so in denial that we should ever be the prey side of that. We can be predators. We're good with that. But we are also prey. And so it doesn't mean that we're not careful, that we don't take safety precautions, but to be offended when there are predators on the edges of our civilization and therefore want to kill them all, that's going too far. That's not acknowledging. That's part of that denial. And our obsession with our own safety and our own comfort. And so I think that's another thing that can approach, is to go out for wanders, to go out for walks, even like you did in Istanbul, even when it's cold, even when it's hot. Be safe, but still, it's raining. It's not just something to, oh my God, it's rain. We can't, it's going to be bad weather tomorrow. What will we do without rain? And how do we just feel it and appreciate it again? And stop expecting ourselves to always be dry, always be exactly the right temperature, and therefore avoiding any form of discomfort or death.
It's funny that you bring that up, because one of those practices that I probably haven't told many people about, again, because I have for a long time assumed, oh, this is just me. But if I were to name it, it's a practice I call storm chasing. And in fact, it has everything to do with embracing and entering into extremes of weather. Because I find that I understand aspects of God in the storms and in the loudness of the ocean and in thunder that I don't otherwise know. So, I mean, for example, recently, last winter, I went to a river that is in drivable distance, and I knew that the river would be swollen with water and loud, and I knew this river also had a lot of giant boulders that you could kind of hop from boulder to boulder to get close to the center of the river. So on a very, very rainy day, I got my rain pants and raincoat and boots on and did my hop out to the middle of the river, and then just basically hunkered down on a boulder and just let the roar of the river, the lashing of the rain become me in a way. I just sort of let myself be in that sound and almost be overwhelmed to the point of being silenced.
Awe.
Yeah, it's awe. That's a really good word. That's a really good word. And that awe is kind of a tonic to the soul in some ways. It's hard to put into words, but I guess on some level, you're reminded of who you are. You're reminded of your smallness in some ways. You're reminded of the fact that the sacred is everywhere and not just in those comfortable places that you're referring to. So I've actually taken to trying to find regular opportunities to get out and maybe not be uncomfortable so much. I love rain gear for that reason. Right? But if you can get rain gear or find a way to be in the weather where you're not distracted actually by discomfort, I think it can be a really powerful thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to share those stories because on some level, it's like this is a sacred moment, even if you don't have that word. And so people won't understand. I don't want to share it. But by not speaking it, it remains invisible. It's not integrated into the wholeness of your spiritual life. And I think that story is beautiful. Thank you.
Well, I guess one reason I maybe hesitate to tell my stories of storm chasing or storm embracing, whatever you want to call it, is because something odd happens to me, and more often than not, I cry. It's not because I'm sad at all.
No, it's because it's holy.
I guess that's what it is.
Tears of the presence of Christ.
Yeah. Yeah, so often my tears will just join with the rain running down my face, and there are no words beyond that, actually. So I think that's one of the reasons I hesitate to talk about it, because I just don't always understand it, which is fine.
How do we enter into these relationships with birds or with our garden? It's like uncomfortable to even talk about because there's no 1, 2, 3. There's no objective explanation of it. Just like our relationship with God, just like how we pray. And sometimes the answers to the prayer are nothing what we had in mind. Sometimes it's exactly what he had in mind. And sometimes it's not answered at all. And all of them are miraculous. All of them are part of prayer. And so I think that's it. It's like opening ourselves up, paying attention. I just read something recently. It was like, we can enter into deeper relationship with life, shall we say, a more spiritually alive life. One of the ways is just by paying attention. Just by paying attention to what happens. Like my spiritual director told me once as I was like describing a thing in my day, what if your life was like a dream? What if you treated what happens in your day like you think about your dreams? Like, what could this mean? What if all of life was that sort of magical? What if all of life was infused with holiness, with the presence of God? What if?
You and I, before the last podcast, had talked about caring for aging parents, and you had talked about the burden for helping your mom in these later stages of her life has been pretty heavy. But in retrospect, I was just thinking back on that, and the question that came to my mind is, where is God in this? Where is God in this? Because I think that that is part of this stance we're talking about. That if you believe that God is in everything, then that is a question that we ought to be asking often, whether it's a beautiful sunset or a storm or a broken friendship. Because
even more scary, like the political chaos right now.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I do think that stance of awareness that you spoke of earlier does allow us to be surprised, and that's a good thing. I think there is also the intentionality about it as well. I think that while it's nice to hear stories of how other people, encounter nature sacramentally, expecting, the divine presence, I do think we also need to find our own way. Part of that is remembering how has it been for us, but it's also knowing who we are, knowing how we respond, knowing the nature of relationship for us. And I think then that requires courageous creativity, willingness to step into the unknown, but also to say to yourself, I'm going to try this. I'm going to do this thing that hasn't been done. I think that it does take courage, but I think creativity is the better word because it makes that process more fun. It makes it more joyful. It makes it more engaging. Yeah.
And I love how you say the nature of relationship is different for you. When you're pregnant, you're about to have a baby. There's all these books and there's all these friends who have all this advice. And it's just different. Every single mother, every single child is just different. And it's frustrating because no one can tell you what to do. You got to figure it out yourself. Every single relationship, every romantic relationship, every one of them is different. Even within your own life, you can look backwards and see how you were even different in each relationship. And so exploring the relationship, the nature of relationship with God, of all things, is very unique to you. And yet we're in this together. And so what we learn from one another is definitely part of it. It's like in the Wild Church Network and in Seminary of the Wild, we talk about there's no one way to do this. There is no doing this wrong or right. And so even in the field guide that we wrote, we're not going to tell you what to do, but we're going to share stories. Mm-hmm. So that's why sharing stories in the work in podcasts that you're doing is so important, because it's through narrative, through stories, through our experiences that we can support one another and be in this collective relationship together. But it's finding our own unique way within that collective. Both of them are true. We need to remember that. We need to remember who we are. And culture, empire especially, doesn't really support that. Institutionalization needs everyone to sort of fit in a certain way so that a lot of people, even education, can be served at once. But what do we lose in that? One of the questions I ask, is there a way to support that individuality and at the same time support a we mentality of we are in this together, in this interconnection? And I think it's not either or.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what I admire about your work and what I recognize in your work that I value with my work, the podcast and with Circlewood. And that is, we've got to make ways for people to understand that they're not alone in this. That on some level, we all desire reimagined, reborn faith practice. And so
it's meant to constantly be reborn.
Yes, right.
That's how it's meant to be. And yet we get caught up in the way it used to be, the way we think it used to be, because that's not even true. Yeah. We don't know. I think it's always meant to be fresh and new, like all of life, like every ecosystem. There's change is absolutely essential. There's nothing stays the same.
We've been in conversation with Victoria Loorz, co-founder of the Wild Church Movement and director of the Center for Wild Spirituality. For more information about her work, please go to the show notes for this episode at earthkeepers.online. Earthkeepers Podcast is a production of Circlewood, an organization that encourages people to pursue a more ecologically conscious faith. Our executive producer is James Amadon, and our sound engineer is Dave Olfers. Lana Rasmussen is our podcast editor, and Jesselyn Gentry is our social media coordinator. Forrest Reed is the composer of our original music, and I'm Forrest Dinsley, your podcast host. Thank you, friends, for listening, and I hope you'll join us again for our next episode of the Earthkeepers Podcast.